After World War II, America emerged as a superpower, largely because Europe and many other regions were ravaged by the conflict. Former empires like Britain, Italy, and France were left in shambles, while Russia seized control over half of Europe. At the same time, America's influence began to stretch across the globe, extending its reach into Asia, where the 1960s would see intense conflicts like the Vietnam War, and into South America and South Asia, regions experiencing tumultuous changes and popular uprisings. As America set about rebuilding Europe and Japan, it inadvertently set the stage for its own relative decline as an economic titan. These nations, once devastated, began to revitalize and rebuild their industries, gradually catching up to, and in some areas, surpassing, American economic dominance. This shift mirrored the dynamics of organized crime, where America, like a global mafia don, used front bosses in foreign lands to maintain its interests. From Pakistan, the Middle East, Iran, Italy, Great Britain, France, parts of North Africa, Cuba, before Castro's regime, Vietnam to Japan, America's global influence resembled that of a shadowy empire, maneuvering behind the scenes to control and coordinate its international network, echoing the Underworld's clandestine operations. In 1974, a team of British journalists ventured into the heart of Japan to uncover the shadowy world of one of the most formidable criminal organizations ever known, the Yakuza. For centuries, the Yakuza had woven their dark threads through the fabric of Japanese history, from the era of the samurai to the sleek boardrooms of modern businessmen. During this pivotal meeting, the Yakuza's enigmatic culture and sprawling operations were laid bare, revealing not only the intricacies of their criminal activities, but also the staggering extent of their influence across Japan. The Yakuza's power was so pervasive that during state visits, such as President Eisenhower's tour, the Japanese police would often enlist their help for security. Imagine, for every uniformed officer lining the streets, there was a Yakuza member lurking nearby, a stark symbol of their deep-rooted presence and formidable sway over the nation. This collaboration underscored an eerie truth. The Yakuza were not just a mafia. They were an integral part of the state's apparatus, shadow warriors in sharp suits, controlling Japan with a silent, iron grip. Here is the article. The formidable character on the right is a Buddhist Grand Monk. He is also a gangster boss, the godfather of an organization which can only be described as the Japanese Mafia. The power of the Japanese gangsters extends from the streets, where they recruit labor as well as running protection rackets in wealthy areas, to politics, where their influence extends to government level. They operate beyond the law and in secret. Their methods are as ruthless as those of Capone or the Mafia today. Yet recently they allowed a television team from Yorkshire TV, headed by Anthony Thomas, to film their activities, including the initiation ceremony pictured above. Next Tuesday, the first of his 3 films about Japan will be shown on ITV. Below he describes in detail how Japan's underworld operates, the Japanese Godfather. Kamagasaki is a suburb of Osaka. It is also a refuge for criminals, dropouts, untouchables — Japan has its own caste system — and all those who have rejected or been denied permanent employment. With the exception of the shopkeepers, the district lives on day-to-day labor. It is a rule of Kamagasaki that no employer asks for credentials or identification. At 5 in the morning, outside the Kamagasaki labor exchange, at least 5,000 men were queuing for the only work available, daily contract labor at the docks and on the construction sites. Some of the vacancies were being offered by hard-pressed officials inside the labor exchange, but a great deal more was happening on the streets outside. Rows of buses, private cars and vans were parked on 2 sides of the exchange. A figure was written on every windscreen, not the price of the vehicle, but the rate of pay for a day's labor. The men who offered this work, discussed conditions and later drove the vehicles to the sites, were Obayashi, junior gangsters, as my companion, a young socialist from the welfare office, described them. And they belonged to the brotherhoods that worked directly for the employers. Superficially, at least, the gangsters and the workers seemed to be on an equal footing. They squatted together in small huddles, bargained and argued, and sometimes workers would break away from these groups and go elsewhere. It seemed the Kamagasaki people showed much warmer feelings towards the Obayashi than this young socialist who had dedicated his life to their community. "It's a problem of class, a problem of education," he told me. "The Kamagasaki gangsters are working class in origin. They are the people, and they do not realize that they are working for their oppressors." The social worker suggested a tour of the area. Rooms, like jobs, are available on a day-to-day basis, and those workers who had missed their opportunity were now sleeping on the floor of the exchange or in the streets. We walked past blocks of lodging houses varying from 5-story concrete buildings with pretentious foyers and plywood cells, measuring 6 feet by 3 foot and mostly windowless, to tumble-down shanties with cells cut to half that size on a double-decker principle. Just 3 foot 6 inches from floor to ceiling, with a ladder serving the top deck. People literally had to dress in the narrow corridors or in the streets. Prices for a room varied from 20 pence to £1 per night. I discussed the possibility of filming with the social worker, but he doubted whether the people would tolerate a unit. They had already been betrayed by the government television channel, who cynically selected a new building here, a corner of a hospital ward there, and propagandized about the new Kamagasaki. If I was to film, there was to be no whitewashing, a request that I was to hear again from an entirely different quarter. After my first brush with the Obayashi of Kamagasaki, I gained many random impressions of their involvement at all levels of society. A vast, sprawling mansion in northern Kyushu was described by my guide as the home of a gangster racehorse owner with a major shareholding in the film industry. A man who had devoted his life to ex-coal miners in the Fukuoka area stopped a seedy character on a motor scooter and introduced him to me as the local gangster. Then, one day when I'm asleep, he mimed slitting his own throat with a forefinger. The gangster approved. In a small family printing business, working for the radical Bahairan organization, I was shown pictures, terrifying pictures, of gangsters breaking up picket lines and policing shareholders' meetings of large companies. In Tokyo, I was assured by responsible journalists that the gangs give open support to senior members of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. But such matters are kept out of print. Superintendent Tadashi Watanabe of Tokyo's Gangster Squad, a leading authority on the subject, explained to me that in spite of their modern image, the Yakuza, the Japanese term for gangster, have deep historical roots. During the shogunate period, approximately the middle 14th century to the middle 16th century, and an unhappy time of civil wars, local police were appointed and financed by the daimyo, feudal lords. If the police were corrupt or negligent, or the daimyo themselves failed to provide proper protection, or, worse still, used their police as agents of oppression, the peasants would enlist the help of wandering samurai. The Yakuza are the descendants of these benevolent mercenaries. Kurosawa's 7. Samurai were Yakuza, no more, no less, and the parallels with the early Mafia were obvious. In Japan, however, the villain was not a marauding foreigner, but, I had to admire the superintendent's frankness, the policeman. Gangsters, you must understand, are traditionally right-wing, and their wartime role was patriotic fundraisers and recruiters. In the post-war period, the concept of democracy and ideological freedom prevailed, and the labor movements took root in this country. The Yakuza are bitterly opposed to those breaks with tradition. The traditionalists and the people who held power used the gangsters to break up organized labor. He said the gangsters' professional activities involved protection, gambling, labor recruitment, theatrical and sports promotion, and the running of mobile shops. They also held wild jamborees outside the main prisons when gangsters were released, held celebrations on the opening of gangster shops, Capone-style funerals, and the sacred rites of initiation into the brotherhood. The superintendent was sure of his statistics. There are 21,980 gangsters. The actual number I was to discover is closer to 10 times that figure, divided into 128 gangs. The biggest gang has approximately 8,000 members, the second biggest 3,000, and so on. My purpose is the extermination of the gangster movement, firstly by humane treatment of gangsters, and secondly by more thorough search. When I told Mr. Watanabe that I wanted to talk to the gangster leaders, learn about and perhaps film some of their operations and ceremonies, he assured me that outsiders, let alone those with cameras, were simply forbidden. In every sense, I was wasting my time, perhaps the faintest hint that I was also wasting his. Early the next day, I phoned every contact I had. Most of them were still asleep. I asked them all, and with passion, to do everything in their power to arrange a meeting with the gangsters, or if that failed, the leaders of a right-wing organization with gangster links. I told them to pass on a series of guarantees, total objectivity, no prejudgment, and perhaps world television coverage. A week later, I was told to be outside my hotel with the latest interpreter, a young girl called Maya. We were met by Koji Nakamura, one of the most able journalists in Japan. He had come by car, and on our way out of Tokyo we picked up a young man whose affiliations I never quite understood. He appeared to be an active trade unionist with strong police and gangster connections. Evidently, he was responsible for setting up the meeting. As we traveled, Koji filled in some of the details. We were on our way to the very top. The man who had agreed to see me was Mr. Keizo Take, head of TK Productions, whose sole purpose was to guard the safety of Mr. Eisaku Sato, the former LDP Prime Minister. Mr. Take is the president of Zenai Kaigi, the biggest and most powerful federation of right-wing and gangster organizations. According to Koji, Mr. Take had shown his strength publicly during Eisenhower's 1960 visit to ratify the security treaty between Japan and the United States. Word had gotten round in security circles that a massive left-wing protest would be organized against the visit, and Tokyo Police Headquarters decided to station one man at 1-meter intervals on either side of the route between Haneda Airport and Eisenhower's first stop, the Imperial Palace. With the 18,000 police in Tokyo, it was calculated that there was sufficient manpower only for 1 man per 2 meters of the route, so an appeal was made to Mr. Taki's organization. Zenai Kaigi were able to match the Tokyo police force man for man, and when Eisenhower drove into the city, his safety was ensured by an incongruous partnership. Policeman, gangster. Policeman, gangster, on both sides of the route. Our car stopped outside a massive wooden archway leading to the grounds of a Buddhist temple. Koji casually dropped the most astonishing fact in this whole affair. By the way, Mr. Take enjoys the highest Buddhist status as a Grand Monk. No fiction writer would have dared such a combination. As we got out, 2 men emerged simultaneously from a large convertible parked on the other side of the street. Monks by their dress, if nothing else. A hand slipped out of a grey robe and gestured towards the temple gate. We walked in. Nobody spoke. The route was lined with small temples and shrines. Somewhere to our left, there was a heavy rumble of drums. As we reached an open square, a group of women were kneeling on the steps of a temple, intoning a monotonous chant. Children were playing nearby. After the snarl and pressure of central Tokyo, there was a delicious feeling of space and peace. A young man in military uniform materialized on the path beside us. He said in good English, "Will you please follow me, Mr. Thomas?" We were shown into a large 2-story building at the center of the complex. According to custom, shoes were left at the door, and we climbed a wooden staircase. All conversation stopped as we entered an upstairs room. It was at least 40 feet square, surrounded on 3 sides by paper screens, and I was surprised to see about a dozen dark-suited men, 2 of whom were carrying cameras. There were no chairs, no pictures, no adornment, but a number of low tables and cushions had been arranged in horseshoe formation in the center of the floor. A man in a simple white robe stood apart from the others. He was massively well-built, round-faced, and quite bald. I took him to be in his middle 50s. For a few moments both parties stared at each other in silence, and then Koji cracked the tension with a quick rush of introductions. Cards were exchanged, and the gentleman in the white robe beckoned me to a cushion beside him at the head of the horseshoe. Everybody was ordered to use their cushions, including Maya, who sat next to me. We welcome any attempt to report our case seriously. Maya, nervous and very tense, was translating in breathless whispers. We have come to learn that the press and television are controlled by the left, and for that reason have no wish to tell the truth. We hope, Mr. Thomas, you will have the integrity to report everything you see. The two men with cameras were faithfully shuffling about on their knees inside the horseshoe. Front, face and profile. Flash, flash, all the way round the room. I assumed that they were minor functionaries in the Take organization. For the survival of our country, we would do anything, even kill. We have already used force and won. I could organize a coup d'etat tomorrow. I have the money and the men. What would a monk be if he did not love his country? The whole group clapped, then turned to me. I had no idea that I would be required to do anything but ask questions. But, as the senior guest, I was now required to make a formal speech, right off the top of my head. Of course, there were enormous gaps between my own declarations and the speeches, no less passionate, which followed. All of the speakers had accepted an alliance with the forces and interests that were actually destroying their tribal world, and the personal feelings and deep relationships they so admired were, of course, only permitted within their own tribe. The men in that room, whose name cards gave them titles such as Chief of Intelligence, Vice President, Representative of the Nagoya area, belonged to the Central Committee of Zen-ai Kaigi. Some were Yakuza and ex-Yakuza bosses. Others were political specialists who took no direct part in gangster operations. All of them related upwards to their president, Mr. Take. At the end of the formal meeting, the room was cleared for supper, and Mr. Take told the two photographers that they were no longer required. This seemed astonishingly out of character and ungenerous, but I later learnt that they had been sent by the police. It may have been coincidence, but my relationship with Tokyo Police Headquarters improved remarkably after that meeting. During the following weeks, I developed a surprisingly warm relationship with Mr. Take. He explained that he had been arrested 40 times and once spent 22 days in custody. 40 policemen involved in the incident had been demoted to lower ranks. At the beginning of September, the film unit arrived from England, and I asked Mr. Take if he would organize a meeting on the lines of our first encounter. He promised something far more spectacular, and a date was suggested for the end of the month. We finally agreed on September 24th, a public holiday. Filming started in Kamagasaki. It was a bad move, and we were all arrested. Although the police had been warned in advance, and I had also sent a list of locations to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo, the sight of cameras seemed to precipitate official action. A senior police inspector told us, "We are a democratic country, and we have no objection to you filming anywhere you choose. The Japanese are sincere in this, but we cannot accept responsibility for your presence here. If the people don't trust you, we will have a riot on our hands. We are not particularly worried about your lives, but we don't want a diplomatic incident." We were then given specific orders never to return to Kamagasaki. It was obvious only one man was powerful enough to overrule both the police and the government. I phoned Mr. Take at the temple, and he agreed to cancel a trip to Taiwan and meet me at the Royal Hotel Osaka. However, there was a slight complication. A visiting trade delegation of Red Chinese was booked into a wing on the 3rd floor, and uniformed police were stationed at all approaches. To the building and the lobby was swarming with members of the special branch. At 7 in the afternoon precisely, Mr. Take walked into the middle of this circus, accompanied by a delegation of monks. He shouted a greeting across the foyer, and every special brancher in sight froze. I joined him at the reception desk, where he specified a suite as near as possible to the Chinese. His whole party enjoyed this joke. We swept off towards the lift, with special branch following. As soon as we entered our lift, there was a scuffle to commandeer the other 5, and the special branch tumbled out behind us at the 3rd floor in 5 separate batches. Mr. Take and his monks rolled on towards the Chinese wing, where 2 plainclothes men sat at every door of the occupied suites. They rose to attention as we passed and joined the rest of Mr. Take's followers. Finally, the Grand Monk paused at the door of his own suite, turned to the followers and said, "Sorry, gentlemen, this is as far as you can go." Inside, he came straight to the point. I was now with our 4th interpreter, Yukiko, a brilliant girl who stayed with us for the rest of the trip. "He wants to know why you called him," she said. I told Mr. Takei the story of our arrest and asked for his authority to film in Kamagasaki. Did he want to know my reasons? "Friends don't ask questions," he said. "I will introduce you to the top man in Osaka." He flicked through a black directory, reached a particular telephone number, dialed it, and was put through immediately. After the call, he said, "Mr. Yamada will be here in 10 minutes. 5 minutes later, we were back in the corridor with the special branch, enjoying a repeat performance of our arrival in reverse. Outside the hotel, a white Lincoln Continental pulled up. The chauffeur rushed around to the passenger side, and Mr. Y. Yamada, president of the Osaka Tile Company, president of the 3 Building Company, president of the Osaka Entertainment Company, president of the Osaka Office Equipment Company, and president of the Osaka Street Cleaning and Garbage Removal Company, entered the foyer. He acknowledged the reception committee, and once again we were all on our way to the Chinese wing. Mr. Yamada is everybody's idea of a gangster. He is almost perfectly square, with astonishingly wide shoulders, a barrel of a torso, and a full height of somewhere between 5 feet 3 inches. He wore the wide-lapelled, double-breasted suit of a senior Yakuza, a diamond ring, and a generous helping of gold teeth. He agreed to delegate one of his senior lieutenants, Mr. Fuji, the Yakuza chief of the Kamagasaki area, to deal with our problems. In the immediate future, the Brotherhood would be busy, but Mr. Yamada suggested 3 consecutive filming days in the following week. It was agreed that Mr. Fuji and Mr. Yamada would join us for dinner at the Royal the night before shooting was due to begin. In the meantime, we returned to Tokyo to honor our September 24th appointment with Mr. Take. It was spectacular, as promised. Mr. Take had gathered representatives from 2 of his private armies, in blue and khaki uniforms, the right-wing political leaders representing nationalist organizations, student, religious and cultural movements, and at least 400 gangsters from brotherhoods throughout the country. Mr. Yamada and his people were not present, however. Apparently there was bad feeling between Tokyo and Osaka, and Mr. Take warned that it would be tactless to mention our association. The speeches, aimed at the British public, rang with warnings of communist takeover, the subversion of the media, and education. The American-imposed constitution was denounced, and the emperor saluted. When we decide that a crisis is close by, we will resign from all official posts to be free to take our own private action. We have our own organizations, which we can commit to the nation. Some of the hardcore Yakuza, bored by the political nature of the meeting, stood in the temple grounds outside the main hall, until one of their number, a Mr. Shino from Tokyo, took the floor. "We are gangsters. The mass media, being infiltrated by the communists, has labeled us as a violent antisocial element. On the contrary, we are peace-loving and always side with the weak. We are the heart of Japan, and we live in her traditions." The gangster took his seat, and the next speaker introduced himself as a member of the ruling LDP party. The following night, Mr. Yamada and Mr. Fuji met us for dinner at the Royal Hotel, Osaka. The Kamagasaki boss was in his mid-30s, and before very long had edged his senior out of the conversation and took charge of the meeting. He wanted to know my precise reasons for filming in Kamagasaki. I told him why. He considered the situation carefully and then repeated word for word what the man at the welfare office had said. No whitewashing. Kamagasaki for what it is, or you do not come in. The next day, a minibus and half a dozen gangsters arrived at the hotel. The foreign tourists and businessmen must have wondered what was happening as this mixed group of gangsters and Yorkshiremen crossed the foyer with lights and cameras. Mr. Fuji had arranged every location requested: a lodging house, the park, the labor exchange, a bar, and a bathhouse. He even provided a gangster electrician. No sooner had filming begun when a police car drew up outside the lodging house. We had, of course, blatantly disobeyed police orders never to return to the district. But as soon as it was clear who we were with, there were smiles all around. Mr. Fuji, however, did not reciprocate. He has a poor opinion of the force. The Kamagasaki boss left us in the care of 2 men. He made several visits to our locations, often with his 2 small daughters. Sometimes he wore the full Yakuza uniform, the dark pinstripe suit and polo neck, but more frequently, the weather was still very hot. He simply walked the streets in his underpants. This seemed particularly important to him, and he once used underpants to illustrate the better qualities of Kamagasaki. He compared his district to the status-conscious middle-class suburbs, where so much depended on a show of material wealth. In his eyes, Kamagasaki was a place where men were judged by their real character. We were seldom out of gangster hands while in Osaka. By day we worked, by night we were organized by Mr. Fuji. We moved as a body through the fashionable bars in central Osaka. This was an important part of the Yakuza mystique, to be on show in the most expensive places, working-class lads, equal to the best of them. During our time off-duty moments, we learned a great deal about the Brotherhood and its protocol. The greatest crimes in the Yakuza moral code are those committed against the group. A mistake or an act of incompetence that brings serious consequences to others requires an act of atonement before all members affected. The miscreant is required to cut off the joint of a finger, beginning with the little finger of the left hand. Even Mr. Fuji has lost 2 joints. A premeditated act against the interests of the Brotherhood can be more severely punished, even with death. To kill for the Brotherhood and then give oneself up to the police is paying service, and is a necessary step to seniority. Mr. Fuji has spent 8 years inside after paying service 5 times on Mr. Yamada's behalf. As we worked on, the areas of permitted and unpermitted crime became clearer. The Yakuza never rob and are only permitted to kill within the Brotherhoods. Sentences passed for this kind of murder seldom exceed 2 years. They extort protection money in the fashionable bars, but never in the poorer areas. Refusal to pay prompts violence against property. Physical intimidation against anyone other than gangsters or proven aggressors is forbidden by the police. Mr. Fuji, like most of the Yakuza, is from peasant origins. As a teenager, he had been thrown against one of the harshest economic systems ever created, and finally found sanctuary within the tribe. The chiefs he served were some of the most powerful figures in the establishment. The Kamagasaki people whom he championed with passion were the worst victims. There is no position on the contemporary political spectrum for a Mr. Fuji. He belongs to an ancient Japanese order where the post-industrial structure simply does not apply. It was a thundery November evening when we were finally invited to the inner sanctum to witness the initiation of 3 young men into the tribe. The meeting took place in an upstairs hall in central Osaka. Black-robed elders of the Brotherhood were assembled before a Buddhist altar. Banners hung around the hall proclaiming the names and deeds of the great Yakuza of history. Mr. Isamu Makta, the high priest, consecrated a bowl of sake, which was passed to Mr. Yamada, the Osaka boss, and to the 3 initiates. There was an exchange of vows and a contract of lifetime service. The marriage between the initiates and the Brotherhood was blessed by the high priest. It was quite dark when we eventually filed down the stairway into the 20th century. The elders waited on the pavement while chauffeurs collected Lincolns and Thunderbirds from the garage. As he said goodbye, a senior gangster pressed his card into my hand and asked for a special favor. When I returned to London, would I send him a color postcard of Queen Elizabeth? The end.